All right, we're going to get started. Good morning. It's nice to see so many of you here early on the Friday before the long weekend, so welcome. I'm Jake Sherman. I'm the director of the Brian Urquhart Center for Peace Operations here at IPI, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to this morning's discussion on finding the road to implementing Security Council Resolution 2286. We're honored to co-host this event with the United Nations Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs, the permanent missions of Poland, France, Iraq, Germany, and Afghanistan to the UN, the World Health Organization, and the Safeguarding Health in Conflict Coalition. And we were commenting this morning, I'm not sure I've ever seen so many logos on top of an IPI invite, but I think it's a strong testament to the importance of this issue and the support that it has within the diplomatic community here in New York. Today's discussion comes on the final day of Protection of Civilians Week, held on the margins of yesterday's Security Council open debate on the protection of civilians in armed conflict. And it's therefore a timely moment for reflection. In 2016, the UN Security Council passed Resolution 2286, a landmark resolution reaffirming the relevance of international humanitarian law, and in particular its rules relating to the protection of the wounded and sick. The adoption of the resolution also represented a strong political commitment to protect the sanctity of healthcare delivery in armed conflict. Since then, the protection of medical care in armed conflict has received sustained attention at the Security Council, but unfortunately, mostly because of violations. The Council's political commitment in 2016 has yet to translate into significant and concrete change on the ground. As we will hear further today, research shows that attacks on healthcare continue unabated. Impediments in access, both visible and less visible, to medical care for populations affected by armed conflict, and related access by medical care providers to those populations, have an immediate impact on the ability to provide medical care to those who need it and create long-term consequences for the health of entire populations. We have with us today an extremely knowledgeable panel who will look at different ways in which Resolution 2286 can be implemented and at how member states and relevant institutions can concretely follow up on initiatives to better protect the wounded and sick in armed conflict. Before we turn to our panel, let me first turn to Ambassador Joanna Ranicka, the Permanent Representative of Poland, and then Deputy Permanent Representative Anne Gauguin from the Permanent Mission of France. Ambassador, please.
Good morning, everybody. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues, distinguished panelists. Allow me to share with you a few thoughts. First of all, I welcome you to this policy forum on finding the road to implementing Security Council Resolution 2286. It has been 1 year since Poland held the presidency of the Security Council in May 2018, and we co-organized the side event on protecting and caring for wounded and sick in armed conflict. I am very glad that today we continue the discussion about further implementation of this important resolution dedicated to the protection of medical care in armed conflict. While taking stock of the progress achieved, we should emphasize the importance of WHO surveillance system for attacks on healthcare launched in January 2018. It addresses the knowledge gap on the extent and nature of attacks on healthcare and provides standardized and systematic approach to collecting data in this regard. During the April this year Area Formula meeting, jointly organized by France and Germany, we discussed good practices undertaken by a range of actors to enhance the protection of medical care in conflict. The UN General Assembly included in its December's resolution on human rights and terrorism a provision that calls on states to ensure that counter-terrorism laws do not impede medical and humanitarian activities. While the international humanitarian law clearly states that any attacks against medical care in armed conflict are prohibited, the gap between the international humanitarian law principles and real-life situations unfortunately exists and even expands. Attacks on healthcare continue around the world with impunity. We need to support and advocate towards full compliance with international humanitarian law obligations that protect the wounded and sick, medical personnel, and humanitarian personnel exclusively engaged in medical duties. Poland remains committed to the issue of protecting healthcare in the conflict zones. Attacks on healthcare target not only healthcare workers and establishments. They deprive civilians of access to first aid and undermine healthcare system in whole conflict zone. Many countries with attacks on healthcare face shortage of health workers, and ongoing violence will only worsen the situation. This year, we are marking the 70th anniversary of the Geneva Convention, and there is a need to accelerate efforts and call on states and not state actors to universally respect, implement, and ensure compliance with international humanitarian law. We need to build on good practices so that we can ensure better protection of medical workers from all sides. Today's discussion is a very good opportunity to elaborate concrete action in order to ensure safety of medical personnel and allow them to do their job in saving lives and reducing suffering. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you, Ambassador.
Thank you. Good morning to all. And first, I'd like to express my thanks to IPI for hosting this event on finding the road to implementing Resolution 2286, a resolution that was adopted unanimously by the Security Council in May 26, with the co-sponsorship at the time of more than 80 member states, and with a very clear and very simple aim that we can and must universally share, protecting the delivery of medical care in situations of conflict. And I would like to really start by paying tribute to all medical personnel deployed in situations of conflict for their dedication and for their courage. While the atrocities of war are plain to see on our screens, our societies go numb, but those doctors and those medical workers don't. They are the true heroes. They bring assistance to all wounded and sick based on people's needs, making no discrimination as to nationality, race, religious beliefs, class, or political opinions. And to quote Henri Dunant's famous words, their duty is to help without asking whom. Humanity in war is what we demand, is what Peter Moore, the head of ICRC, commented when the resolution was adopted. And one of the most basic and fundamental prerequisites to that effect is to make sure that those who can save civilian lives and who can relieve the wounded and the sick are protected. Tragically, as Jake highlighted, this is not happening more today than it was 3 years ago when the resolution was adopted. There have been more than 300 attacks against medical personnel and infrastructures since last January, according to the WHO database. This is, of course, unacceptable. Now, of course, this is why we are all gathered here today, is to reflect and to strengthen our resolve on, better implementing the resolution. It's, of course, easier said than done. So what should we do? And I'd like maybe to offer 3 ideas for your consideration and for the consideration of the panel. The first idea is that there must be a quantum leap in our collective efforts, meaning that member states must recommit to their obligations and they must find ways to translate them into practice. And this is why France had initiated in October 2017 political declaration comprising several concrete commitments specifically aiming at the implementation of the resolution. And this declaration is now endorsed by 41 states. And we really must ensure that these commitments taken in this declaration are fully respected. But France and Germany, and the ambassador of Germany is here with us this morning, are determined to go beyond and to identify concrete and operational ways to strengthen respect for international humanitarian law more generally, and all the more this year, which mark the 70th anniversary of the Geneva Conventions. As both ministers Jean-Yves Le Drian and Heiko Maas announced last month, on April 1st, our two countries will present during the high-level week this September a call for action on strengthening respect for international humanitarian law, and this call for action will be open for endorsement by all member states. Second idea is that training is crucial. If we want Resolution 2286 to become a reality, combatants must be trained to respect it. France is fully committed to ensure proper training on the issue of the protection of medical personnel and infrastructures. And this means, of course, proper training of our own armed forces, but also training troops from states with which we cooperate militarily, and notably in the Sahel region. It's very important to ensure that military practice and military manuals adequately address issues relating to the protection of healthcare. And in addition, it's essential also to educate armed groups to ensure that these groups who are warring parties and who are in zones of conflicts understand their obligations under international humanitarian law and understand the consequences of attacking medical care. This is why we support the work undertaken by organizations such as Geneva Corps in this regard. And finally, last idea, there must be no impunity. Data collection is a first and necessary step. In this regard, we fully support the newly established database by WHO. But we need to go further and to ensure that for each attack, an impartial, independent, and prompt investigation is conducted. We must strengthen judicial national capacities in this regard, and when national accountability mechanisms are insufficient or inadequate, we must support the resort to international accountability mechanism. We strongly believe that systematic punishment of attacks against healthcare personnel can also have a deterrent and therefore a preventive effect. So with these words, I will close, and I look forward to the presentation of our distinguished panel. Thank you.
I'm now pleased to introduce to you our panelists this morning. Mr. Len Rubenstein is the founder and chair of the Safeguarding Health in Conflict Coalition, a group of international non-governmental organizations working to protect healthcare workers, services, and infrastructure. Mr. Hans-Jörg Strohmeyer is the chief of OCHA's Policy Development and Studies branch. He has over 20 years of experience with the UN, including in Lebanon, Sudan, Kosovo, East Timor, and Liberia. We're also grateful to have representatives of 2 countries that have direct experience in working to address the challenges facing medical care in armed conflict. Ambassador Adela Raz, the permanent representative of Afghanistan to the UN and previously Deputy Minister for Economic Cooperation at the Afghan Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Ambassador Raz was also the first female to be appointed Deputy Spokesperson and Director of Communications for the President. We're very happy to have you with us today. And Ambassador Mohammed Hussein Ali Bar al-Ulum, the permanent representative of Iraq to the UN, previously the head of the Department of the Americas in the Iraqi Foreign Ministry, and ambassador to Kuwait. You have their full bios in your handouts. Following the panel, I'm going to give the floor to Ambassador Heustjen of Germany to offer his remarks, and then, if time permits, we'll take a few questions. So with that, Len, let me start with you. The Safeguarding Health in Conflict Coalition just came out with its annual report for 2018, and it'd be interesting to hear some of the findings from that and where you see possible avenues for progress. Please.
Thank you, and thanks to IPI for holding this event and to the UN agencies who co-sponsored it, but especially to Poland, France, Germany, Iraq, and Afghanistan for keeping this problem on the international agenda in the face of 3 years of inaction on Resolution 2286. It's so important to have those commitments. The report that the coalition issued, and it's on the side table and available at safeguardinghealth.org, is our 6th report, the most sophisticated methodologically. We found almost 1,000 incidents of violence against hospitals, health workers, and transports in 23 countries. We know some of the findings. What did we find? First of all, you all know how violence is impeding the Ebola response in DRC. In Syria and Yemen, at least 18 hospitals were totally destroyed by aerial attacks. In Syria alone, 100 hospitals were damaged and 23 health facilities were struck multiple times. There were 47 incidents of violence against healthcare we found in the Central African Republic, though we know that is a severe undercount because of the difficulty of reporting there. In the West Bank and Gaza, mostly in Gaza, 500 health workers were injured, mostly in connection with the Great March of Return demonstrations. Many were shot or victims of tear gas. 3 were killed. Vaccinators were killed in 6 different countries, which is an increase from last year. Now, this violence is often understood as a monolithic phenomenon, but we have to understand that context, motives, and methods vary. Airstrikes in Syria, for example, are targeted, where, as far as we can tell, the Saudi-led coalition has engaged in reckless and indiscriminate bombing in Yemen. In the Central African Republic, the targets are often patients of a particular religion or ethnic group who are assaulted inside hospitals by non-state armed groups. In Afghanistan, some armed groups accuse health facilities of not adequately serving one faction or another and force them and other health facilities in the vicinity to close. Attacks on vaccinators often seem designed to undermine the authority of the government or reflect skepticism and hostility to vaccinations generally. As a result, solutions must be tailored to the context, most of them at the national level. We have seen examples of leadership in addressing these threats. In the Central African Republic, the Minister of Health has personally engaged, reaching out to armed groups, supporting medical staffs, and intervening in crises. In Afghanistan, the Minister of Public Health has acted as an interlocutor between the Ministry of Defense and health facilities to try to improve the conduct of Afghan troops. France has integrated protection of healthcare into military training and practice, and we celebrate these acts. But unfortunately, they're isolated cases. 3 years after the adoption of Resolution 2286, we see little or no movement at the national level in other countries on reform of laws governing conduct toward healthcare, changes in military doctrine and training, and the guarantee of adequate and thorough investigations and robust accountability. Each year, the Secretary General solicits information on positive steps states have taken toward carrying out the mandate of Resolution 2286 as part of his report on protection of civilians. Last year's report, and this year's report again, essentially drew a blank. The only step noted in the report was the Geneva Call's deed of commitment for armed groups. He might also have taken note of the examples I've mentioned, but they're very few and far between. So And that's not the only problem. States need to pressure other states to adhere to the law through the use of diplomatic tools such as public statement, démarches where violations occur, and of course, they must cease arms sales to perpetrators of attacks on health services, but those arms sales continue. While national level action is the key, the Security Council still has a central role. Many have given up on the Council because of its passivity after the adoption of 2286, not even adopting the Secretary General's recommendations for implementation. So many suspect that the rhetoric that attacks on healthcare are unacceptable has been replaced by acceptance. But we must insist that the Council play its proper role, especially to ensure investigation and accountability where states fail to act. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Len. I think that's an incredibly sobering scene setter and yet also a strong call to action. And it's interesting reflecting, Anne, on the three recommendations that you called for. It sounds like in many ways there may be more scope for countries to act outside of the Council, even among Council members. Perhaps a point that we can come back to. You mentioned Afghanistan several times, and I think that's a great segue to Ambassador Raz, and it would be really interesting to hear more about the experience of Afghanistan and some of the efforts that are being taken to try and better protect medical care. Please.
Thank you, and first let me begin by thanking the International Peace Institute for organizing this timely meeting on the implementation of the Security Council Resolution 2286 related to the protection of health workers and medical facilities in armed conflict. I also like to thank my colleagues from the permanent missions of France, Poland, and Germany that will follow later for their remarks, and I'm also pleased to join this panel with colleagues with greater expertise in the ground, and also with my colleague from the Iraq mission as an example of how we try to mitigate this problem. This is a topic of particular importance to Afghanistan, a country that has been in decades of conflict, and its dire impact on the social fabric of the society, infrastructure, including hospital, clinics, and other healthcare facilities. In this regard, this is an opportunity for us to pay tribute to the efforts and sacrifices of all healthcare and humanitarian workers, not only in Afghanistan, but around the world. They have been in front lines, providing care to the most vulnerable in the most difficult situation, especially in our case. And as Anne said, they are our true heroes. We are pleased that the protection of healthcare and humanitarian workers remain a central focus in the agenda of the Security Council. Resolution 2286 provides a clear base for the states to ensure the protection of medical personnel and humanitarian workers, and we are responsible as state for meeting our obligation under this resolution. For us in Afghanistan, the protection of medical personnel remains a priority, which is being pursued with clear measures and objectives across various government institutions and agencies. As our security forces combat international terrorists, we are giving special focus to avoid collateral damage to civilians, international humanitarian and aid workers, and infrastructures and all military operations. To that end, our forces follow strict guidelines and rules of engagement, as reflected in our national security strategy. Combat operations are coordinated closely with international forces to avoid unintended consequences to the civilian population and medical and humanitarian infrastructure. Any case of a collateral damage is investigated thoroughly, followed by appropriate action for accountability. Recently, an office headed by the Deputy National Security Advisor has been established at the NSC to oversee the issue of civilian protection. And as the report also outlined, we have to give credit to our health institution, especially our Minister of Health, for being very active and engaged and reaching out to our security forces and making sure that they're informed and aware, and with the international community, because we do have a mandate with UNAMA, with the UN organization in Afghanistan, to work with our security forces to make sure when they conduct their operation to respect and follow specific rules and guidelines. But as we work to uphold our commitments, we also highlight the need for all parties in conflict to recognize their responsibility in protecting medical and humanitarian aid workers. The main threat facing medical and healthcare personnel emanates from the continued attacks carried by the Taliban and other terrorist groups in different parts of the country. Deliberate attacks against such facilities and aid agencies have persisted over the past several years. This year alone, up until April, 5 aid workers were killed and many more injured and 18 abducted. Earlier this month, the Taliban attacked 2 aid organizations, Counterpart International and Care International, in the capital of Afghanistan, Kabul, taking the lives of 3 aid workers and 6 civilians. They also said, the Taliban said, this will not be their last assault on the aid workers. The Taliban have also increased focus on restricting the movement and activities of aid organizations, such as the International Committee of the Red Cross and the WHO. They're both in their blacklist. Both Taliban, and of course the reasons, as colleagues mentioned, is that they are not providing fair services to both sides, which is not true, and as well as they have suspicious activities, and they're both these assaults are not correct. Both Taliban and other insurgent groups have used medical and humanitarian infrastructure to launch attacks against Afghanistan and international security forces. And this has been increased since the Kunduz attack, as many may remember, a few years ago it happened. And also their actions signifies that they will not hesitate to place civilians, medical and humanitarian personnel and their protection, and there might be more harms towards them. The Taliban and other insurgents, they don't respect the values of humanity, and their commitments to violence have not changed at all, despite their peace discussion and efforts that's going on to negotiate with them a peace agreement. As I highlighted earlier, additional attacks took place this month during the holy month of Ramadan in general, when ordinary Afghans are observing their religious duties. The year 2013, technically looking, the year 2013 was the highest point of attacks in Afghanistan towards humanitarian aid workers and health workers, about 237 attacks against humanitarian aid workers, where, okay, I have two more minutes. And then there gradually was a decline from 2013 until last year. And that decline, of course, were the specific measures being put. And one reason could be also that there was a reduction of aid workers in Afghanistan. At that time, we had about 223 workers, and today there are about 159. It's a rough number, so it's not a complete and accurate number. But what has been seen is that last year was an increase, and this year alone also there are an increase of attacks by the Taliban and other insurgents on aid workers and humanitarian workers. So therefore, we do reiterate our call on the Taliban to demonstrate a real commitment to peace through deeds. This means giving up the path of violence, ending attacks on ordinary civilians, public infrastructure, medical and humanitarian personnel, and choosing the path for peace for the sake of security and stability in Afghanistan. The requirement outlined in Security Council Resolution 2175 and 2286, as well as the General Assembly resolution on the safety and security of humanitarian and UN personnel, the Geneva Conventions, and all other relevant obligations are clear. Any violation of them constitutes a violation of international humanitarian law. I will conclude by reiterating our appreciation to the IPI and other partners for co-hosting this very important event, and reaffirming once again the firm commitment of the government of Afghanistan to the protection of medical and humanitarian personnel in the country and outside. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador. I think the situation in Afghanistan provides a really useful grounding of how this plays out in a country that has international forces, the activities of your national security forces, but in particular the challenge posed by armed groups, in non-state armed groups in today's conflicts. I think that'll be an interesting comparison now as we turn to you, Ambassador Al-Aloum, to hear about the situation in your country, in Iraq, and where you see both progress and challenges. Please.
Thank you. At the outset, I would like to thank International Peace Institute and all other partners for organizing this important event, which highlights the role of the Security Council Resolution 2286 to protect civilians, particularly medical personnel. Since the adoption of the Security Council Resolution 2286 in May 2016 to April 2018, the International Committee of the Red Cross, ICRC, has documented more than 1,200 incidents of violence against medical staffs all over the world, including killings, abductions, threats, obstruction of ambulance traffic, destruction of medical equipment, and bombing of hospitals. In Iraq, the military operations have taken into account the most basic principles of international humanitarian law while liberating areas controlled by ISIS, which had used civilians as human shields, forcing the security forces to delay the liberation process until safe passages were secured for civilians. Iraqi forces have successfully evacuated tens of thousands of civilians to safe places. The Iraqi respective authorities have taken all possible measures to provide access to life-saving assistance and facilitate passages for authorized humanitarian relief. In this context, I would like to brief you some of the brutal actions committed by Daesh against the medical personnel and services which highly affected the civilians, especially wounded and sick people. One of the doctors who was under the control of Daesh said, we had been subjected to all kinds of threats and warnings by ISIS. They had always forced us to be into the hospitals without pay, of course, and told us to obey their orders. They threatened to confiscate our homes and money and kill us. If we refused to attend constantly, they brought surgeons from different countries to treat their casualties because they never trusted us. Daesh issued a warning to physicians who had fled, return to work, or will seize your property and you can never come back. Also, let me showcase what Daesh did in the main hospitals of Mosul, for example. Al-Shifa Hospital, West Mosul, during the occupation, it was used to house terrorist fighters as well as treat wounded terrorists. It was also used as a fort to slow down the advance of government troops. More than 2,000 explosive remnants of war have been removed from Al-Shifa complex, many of them using mechanical assets to sift through the rubble. with amount of rubble that was present to the hospital site, it was noted that the use of mechanical assets was a necessity. It was assessed that 2/3 of explosive hazards were under rubble and out of sight, with 1/3 being visible on the surface. Close collaboration with UNMAS and UNDP, the hospital site workers and staff, resulted in the confirmation of clearance of the site, allowing staff back into the building. Ibn Sina Hospital, West Mosul. It was a major hospital that served many residents in the area and restores much needed medical services to the district. It was used by Daesh as a treatment center for wounded terrorists and to manufacture ammunition and improvised explosive devices. Al-Khansa Hospital, East Mosul. One of the largest hospitals in Mosul was left burned, leaving it in need for much rehabilitation. At the same time, improvised explosive devices were suspected to be present in parts of the hospital. Al-Khansa Hospital serves as the main provider for maternity and pediatric care for the region. It is estimated that 500,000 women, girls, boys, and men will benefit from improvised health care services as a result of the rehabilitation of this facility. The General Hospital in Beiji, it was completely non-operational for several months following the war against Daesh, depriving all inhabitants to access basic health services. Following clearance, rehabilitation works little by little started. The clinic has reopened end of January 2018. The surgery building, the consulting rooms, and the pharmacy are under construction. After rehabilitation, it is estimated that approximately 200,000 people from Beiji and surroundings will be able to benefit and access health services. The Iron Bridge in Al-Fallujah. The terrorist groups have destroyed the bridge to prevent people from getting benefit from a hospital on the other side of the riverbank. Finally, Iraq highly appreciates the role of OCHA, UNDP, UNMAS, WHO, UNFPA, ICRC, and other donors and partners who supported Iraq during and post-war against terrorism. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Ambassador, for, I think, really highlighting the complexity of this issue by focusing on one particular aspect, which is the use of hospitals by ISIS, the denial that that use actually poses for communities that rely on those institutions, and the challenges of rehabilitation once the fighting is over. We're now going to turn to you, Hans-Jörg, and it'd be interesting, the open debate was yesterday. So given the debate, the SG's report on POC, it'd be interesting to hear about what OCHA is, how OCHA views this, and some of the SG's recommendations, please.
Thank you very much, and thank you very much to IPI and particularly the member states who sponsor this. I'll come back to that a little later. Your leadership is the critical difference in all of this. ICRC, the Secretary General, OCHA, and many others have been highlighting this issue since 2011, 2012. But it is important that member state leadership makes sure that this issue is not only drops off the agenda or is occasionally a conversational item, but that some of the recommendations and the consequences that we've all asked for are going to be taken forward. So in that respect, I think the Secretary General's report yesterday needs to be seen. That, of course, also highlights other priorities, like the general phenomena of urban warfare that is not disconnected from the increasing number of attacks on medical facilities. sexual gender-based violence, displacement, denial of access, which is also connected to this. But chief among the concerns over recent years, increasingly so, is that protection of medical care. And it's not just an aspect of, among other aspects. If you really think about it, this goes to the very heart of IHL. This goes to the very core of why IHL 150 years was actually created. I mean, to be able to provide humanitarian assistance or medical assistance, medical care for the wounded and sick in conflict settings. I mean, that's the origins of IHL in the first place. So these very origins, to just make this plainly clear, are at risk right now. And when we first saw some of those attacks on medical facilities, I mean, they've always existed, but I mean, in increasing numbers, maybe 15 years ago, we're still startled, very honestly. You know, there was disbelief that people would actually go as far as kill humanitarian or medical workers or medical facilities. But sadly so, this has become, as all of you have outlined, not only a routine feature of today's conflict, it feels like it's become one of its primary targets and purposes. I mean, it's very willfully done. And Ambassador, I was very grateful, I think, and you brought this really down to that local level, and that's exactly what we need to do. This is not just about access of international humanitarian agencies in an area. This is most importantly about access of those people who live there to medical aid and care and facilities. And so where many of those facilities are destroyed, international providers are the only way for some of those people to actually have some recourse to medical assistance. And so that's how this whole story makes sense. And that's maybe my second point to pick up on the complexity of this. This is not just the targeting of this. It is that premeditated targeting of medical facilities, including convoys and things. But it's also the looting and destruction of medical supplies very willfully. We have umpteen examples of convoys being stopped, and then the medical supplies are at best looted and used for other purposes, at worst even destroyed on the spot. It is also the intentional disruption, the denial of access and supply lines, and it is the killing, the abduction and harassing of medical staff and aid workers, many of them, again, not only international. We're talking about many of them are those national nurses and doctors, as you said before, who are the real heroes of many of these conflicts. So I really want to make a point of this, that this is not an issue that just highlights the grievances of international organizations getting to areas. It is most importantly the grievances of those on the ground, the medical workers and the victims, for not having medical assistance and recourse to medical assistance. But it is also, in addition to the abducting and harassing, it's also the criminalization of medical and aid work. And that's where some of the counterterrorism measures increasingly become relevant. And we had an opportunity yesterday, a number of us, including the OCHA Assistant Secretary General, to brief the Counterterrorism Committee, and we highlighted this issue among others. And it is, as several of you said, the use of medical facilities very often and increasingly for military purposes or by regular and irregular forces. So all of this amounts to the WHO figures, and luckily we have the beginnings now of surveys and so on. So WHO in 8 conflicts, in the 8 key conflicts that we all have on mind, recorded for 2018 705 attacks on medical facilities and workers, resulting in 451 deaths and 860 injuries. that's just, if I may say so, the hardware, the surface of the picture. The impact, the result of how many tens and hundreds of thousands of people having secondary impacts and effects, including dying and continued suffering, are probably where we need better evidence and are still unrecorded. And as I said, as a side effect, without focusing this discussion on it, the use of explosive weapons in urban areas, this urban warfare issue, accounts for 2/5 of the destruction, is a problem that is serious enough in this context that we need to talk more about it. As I said, in addition to the attacks, it is access that is at stake here. It's blocked, disrupted, impeded, and very often arbitrarily denied. And we have, from all of those countries, many examples, without now going into the details, whether they're in Iraq, Syria, Afghanistan, Mali, and so on, and very often on all sides of the conflict. Aid convoys are emptied of medical supplies. Medical personnel is denied access, what we see very often, to areas held by non-state armed groups. That very often is just the first step to penalizing, criminalizing aid workers as aiding and abetting declared terrorist groups, even though it may just be providing humanitarian help even to some of their families or people under control. We see the same in Nigeria and other places. That's the reality of access. And I think one aspect that you pointed out, this is not just access in terms of medical facilities. It's very often the bridges and the infrastructure leading up to those, because in many of these areas, facilities service a very large community. So, in closing, let us be clear for all of us, and the ICRC made this very clear yesterday in the meeting that I referred to earlier. IHL foresees an entitlement to offer services to parties of non-international armed conflict. That means prohibiting, denying, or impeding such services, an offer of services, is contravening IHL, whether this is for tactical reasons or on counterterrorism or other grounds. And that's where Resolution 2286 of 2016 provides a clear and concise framework, sort of a roadmap for action, as we call it. And the Secretary General has put forward a clear set of recommendations. That is not just the Secretary General's or OCHA's or the United Nations recommendations, that has been elaborated with all the leading international humanitarian agencies, including many of those around here. And it basically focuses on 3 areas of measures: preventive, such as national frameworks, what Afghanistan and others have done; precautionary measures, which also looks at the conduct of military operations, deconfliction, what weapon systems to use where, and corrective measures such as investigations or normative adjustments, strengthening, including at the national level. I'm sure we can talk about this a bit more in the course of the conversation. My key ask, 3 asks of member states here in the room, at the Security Council and across the UN is: number 1, we need to continue this dialogue as a meaningful dialogue. This is not about hierarchies of whether counterterrorism is more important than humanitarian or other political considerations. This is creating the space and the balance for all of these things to coexist, because they need to coexist. So my plea for continued and intensified dialogue, particularly around some of these recommendations and what member states can do to help implement them at their own context and international levels. Secondly, I think investigations are very critical. We just need to show that these things are not just things that we bemoan and we register and record, but that we're serious about wanting to know more, at least about the causes and the origins. It's not necessarily about criminal trials and prosecution and so on and so forth, but it is at least knowing what happened where and by whom. And I think that's a very critical aspect. And the last thing is, part of that promotion of access that we all constantly discuss and support must be clear condemnations of arbitrary denial of access by whatever party, whether it's governments or others. And part of that arbitrary denial is the criminalization of the work of aid workers. Aid workers do work in complex environments with parties to conflict that are declared by some as terrorists, as well as government forces. We understand this. This is why it is important to maintain and safeguard the independence and impartiality of those aid workers by allowing them to go about their work and not criminalize them, particularly at national levels. I'll stop here. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Hans-Jörg. I think 3 quick takeaways from that. I mean, one is underscoring that this really is about the foundations of international humanitarian law. Second, I think that this idea of the secondary effects beyond just the immediate targeting of personnel and infrastructure, and a thanks for 3 very clear ideas and recommendations about what member states can do to take this further. I'm now going to turn the floor over to Ambassador Heuschen of Germany to offer his remarks.
Thank you. Thank you very much for inviting us, but most importantly, thank you very much to you and the IPI for staging this. I think we cannot have enough events like this one to point to the fact and to the problems that you have mentioned. So thank you very much for accompanying the debate that took place yesterday in the Security Council on medical care. You all mentioned 2286, a landmark resolution, but I think we are at the same time conscious of the fact that the fate of this resolution is a bit similar to the fate of many resolutions that have been adopted during the last years. And this fate is that although it's binding international law, it's less and less observed. And this is not only holds true for 2286. And you mentioned several examples. Mr. Rubenstein, I think you had the most sobering scene setting, but you all mentioned what the Taliban do, what Daesh does. And we had in the Security Council, actually during the last 2 weeks, we had twice, because of humanitarian issues, put it on the agenda. We put on the agenda the situation in Idlib, a situation which this is kind of the new normal. What happened in Idlib? In Idlib, it happened that we had the medical facilities in Idlib, they were notified, the coordinates were given, and as a result, some of these notified medical institutions were bombed. We have in the Security Council again and again discussions with our Russian partners about the white helmets. While I think most of us here in the room, I hope everybody here in the room also is of the opinion that these white helmets did an incredible job under extreme difficult circumstances to help the population in besieged cities and towns in Syria. They are called by our Russian friends as terrorists. And Mr. Rubenstein mentioned the indiscriminate bombing of the coalition in Yemen, and I'm grateful for you that you called this out. But at the same time, the Houthis are even worse. I mean, what they have been doing by blocking the access to the Red Sea mills, to preventing the population, the starving population, to get food which is readily available. What we see here is that the fight against humanitarian workers, humanitarian aid is kind of a weapon of warfare. Something that I think nobody believed when, and Mr. Strohmeyer reminded us of the origins of the international humanitarian law and the principles. And you now have, I think you said it, you have premeditated targeting of medical care workers and convoys. And you also, Mr. Rubenstein, mentioned what is happening also today in the DRC with regard to Ebola health workers. So the situation is very dire, and we must not accept that this becomes the new normal. Therefore, again, thanks very much for Mr. Sherman for IPI to stage this. I think that you can see you complained a bit. No, you didn't complain. You mentioned that there's too many co-sponsors on the logo. I see this as positive, that there are so many countries, institutions that are committed to it. And we have been working, and my French colleague Anne has said that, in the German-French joint presidencies, we had put international humanitarian law as one of the major points on the agenda. We did several events, but we didn't do it a one-off exercise, but with the call for action, we want to keep it on the agenda. We want to highlight good practices, and we're going to continue with our Polish friends in August on the occasion of what is the anniversary of the Geneva Convention? What is the 19 August, yeah, no, I would say in how many years, but getting old, 70s, yes. We're going to highlight this again, and we do it together with several countries and make the point. So on the conclusions, I saw also listening to you, I think we are all on the same road. Number one, we must not give up. We have to highlight it, come back to it over and over. We must not accept this as a new normal. So we have to keep up international humanitarian law. We have to redouble our efforts. We have to support, as Anne has put it, and I think you picked it up, the true heroes. And we have to work on this. And then several of you, Anne said it, Mr. Strohmeyer also said it, accountability. This is key. It is very difficult, but we see it also on other war crimes. If you don't try to actually note get records, do investigations of the violation of international humanitarian law. If you don't do this, if you don't threaten with accountability, then people will not stop it. So this is extremely important to do this. We owe it to the victims. We have to get the perpetrators, and it serves as a deterrent. Third one, denial of access. As Mr. Strohmeyer said, it's again, and this is linked to one thing which I think is very important, which is of course difficult to do, but we also have to somehow convey to the armed groups that we have been mentioning, even the Taliban, and I don't know if you can talk to Daesh, and I hope it disappears, but we have to talk to these armed groups as well, that they respect international humanitarian law, that they also accept what on other fields we have adopted in the Security Council on children in armed conflict and sexual violence in conflict. So a lot to do, but we have to do, as Ambassador Raz said, we have to defend the values of humanity. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. We're going to open up the floor to a round of questions and comments. I'd ask that you please introduce yourself. Also, I'll note our representatives, our European representatives, will have to leave shortly, so I want to take the opportunity to thank the three of you for joining us and for your strong support for this issue. Thank you very much. Yeah, the microphone is coming here, and then. Yeah.
Thank you. My name is Firas from the Mission of Iraq. In fact, I have a question to Mr. Strohmeyer. You have mentioned the importance of access, and in case of the parties of the conflicts, one of the parties is terrorist groups. Did you succeed as OCHA to have access? Do you have contact with terrorist group to work on the field? Thank you.
We're going to take a few just here in black.
Hi, this is Fatima from WHO. Thank you again for organizing this event. It's very important and timely in the margins of the POC debate. I have two comments. First, regarding the points that the panelists raised, especially on the next steps and actions that we see coming out of the discussion. And we've seen these solidifying today and also in previous discussions. The advocacy part we have done very well, but I think the next steps was the challenge. So echoing the words of OCHA, maybe it's time now to have a deep dive discussions on some of these points that were raised to really get into how we can implement some of the ideas that came up today. And then the second point I wanted to raise is continued expression of appreciation from the member states and our partners for our work on our surveillance system. As you know, we were mandated by the World Health Assembly to come up with a methodology and a systemic way of collecting information. And I wanted to stress that our focus is on the public health effects of attacks. So we don't look at attribution, we don't look at intentionality of effects of attacks or the types of attacks. So what was discussed already is that if there's clearly a need to go further, and some points were raised by France and others about how we can fill this gap. So looking forward for that to be done, and we can hopefully all do our part to continue to raise awareness, but look at action also. Thanks again.
Hello, I'm Archie Henry with Interaction. Thank you so much for this panel. On data collection, I was curious to know what your thoughts would be on how do we actually improve data collection on the secondary and reverberating effects of attacks on health infrastructure, and how do we then use that information to shape the conduct of parties to the conflict, despite perhaps a reluctance for humanitarian agencies on the ground to be exchanging information with armed actors. So I'd be really curious on your thoughts on that. Thank you very much.
All right, seeing no further questions, we'll come back to the panel. Len, why don't we start with you if you want to respond to any of the questions?
I'll respond first to Fatima's question. I think you're absolutely right that we have to take a deep dive, and I would make one suggestion that it seems so simple, but I think could go a long way. The Secretary General called for reporting of what states are doing to implement this 2286. And that's not happening. And I think if it did happen, it would do two things. One, it would model for other states. And second, it would put pressure on those states. And I think, for example, the work that we've heard about this morning would be very useful to share, and the Secretary General, OCHA, can report on this. But we need to be much more proactive in showing what is happening and what can be done. And of course, as you say, we need to keep at it in terms of strategies, in terms of accountability and investigations, and to improve data collection. And on the question about data collection, it's been a real struggle. It took 5 years for WHO to get its system up and running. And your point about the secondary and long-term effects is even more primitive at the moment. We know what happens when a hospital is bombed. We can count how many people were killed, how much damage there was, but how much access do women who have a obstetric emergency have to care 6 months or 2 years later? What's the impact on the health system in terms of when health workers leave, what happens to the system? We're at a very primitive stage now, but I think there has to be a commitment to both research and tracking these issues, because we know that fragile and conflict-affected states are the ones least likely to meet the Sustainable Development Goals or universal health coverage, which are priorities for the global health community. So we need to do much more to engage in both research and tracking of these issues.
Yes, I think I'm going to answer Fatma's question, a part of it, which is in terms of the next steps. From the perspective the state in terms of experience of Afghanistan, I think there is a responsibility from the state to make sure to put the right measures, and I think you may not find a large number of states who denies those responsibility. I think on that part we're pretty good, and especially in case of Afghanistan, there is no question about our responsibility to take care of it and train our security forces to mitigate the problem. But the second part comes to the insurgent groups, the armed groups, which I think that's the most difficult one for all of us in this room. And I brought that up in a while ago. We had a discussion in the Security Council as well. What type of measures needs to be put in place to pressure the armed groups to comply to the international humanitarian law? And I think that's the most difficult one. And one way I think in terms of our experience, we see it might be effective, because despite how much we raise a voice as a state and saying these are the violations happening by the armed group, I think our voice would be constantly biased, because by default we're in the front line and we're fighting them. And I think the international community and the Security Council and think tanks and independent entities and those who are doing the reporting, I think it's really important that they do highlight and distinguish in terms of the attacks being conducted or assaults being taken by the armed groups. And there should be, I absolutely agree with the recommendation that our colleague from the French permanent mission, Ms. Anne, had, that there has to be consequences, because if one part is highlighting it, and I think that's really important, the second one should be consequences. And we do have at the institution that we are right now working with the UN together. UN is one of the multilateral platforms where it has the tools to put those measures in terms of bringing consequences towards the armed groups. And that could be the sanction committee creating sanctions against those specific groups and individuals or leaders who are part of the armed groups and they're involved in constant killing of aid workers. Because the side effect, as my colleague from the Mission of Iraq mentioned, it's not only, and a colleague from OCHA, it's not only the individuals being killed. I think that's itself is very troubling, but it's also those who have been impacted in a sense, not receiving the aid that they need, and plus those who are discouraged to even join this field and go and reach out to the people who are in dire need. So that would be my recommendation. Thank you.
All the recommendations really are very good and sensitive and acceptable, but the point is, those armed group and the terrorist groups, how can we control them? Yeah. How can we get access to them? And that's the point is, they are violating the human rights law. For example, in Mosul, the Iraqi government, they delayed the liberation of Mosul 9 months because of the terrorist groups, because the government were really under responsibility how to prepare the safe passage for the people to be alive. So the recommendations are very, very important and very respectable, but the point is the implementation, the problem is. But maybe the international organization can help the governments to give aids and help for the people during the conflicts. Thank you very much.
Hans-Georg. Yeah, maybe first on the question that was directed at us. I would like to use that question not so much about what detailed contacts OCHA has where with whom, but how access works. It's not about OCHA alone. First of all, in your question, access or contacts with terrorist organizations. We have very different mechanisms for listing of terrorist organizations. So you have organizations that are declared terrorist at a national level, but not at an international level. You have organizations that are declared terrorist at a bilateral or by a certain grouping, so at a regional level, but not by the United Nations. And you have groups that are listed at the United Nations levels, and all of the implications are slightly different. So even there, already, who is a terrorist group is complex. But I think for us, sort of a mantra, for me, a mantra has always been what Jan Egeland once told us many years ago, when he said, I would speak to the devil if that was necessary to get some relief for people in need. And I think that's the humanitarian mantra and spirit. Unfortunately, we don't have the luxury to sit and decide, I mean, who is better, who is worse, who may have more inclination to respect IHL or not. We have to speak to those who control areas, who do the damage, quite frankly, and who can, in a very instant manner, help us to get aid to people in need. Let me give you an example. In Syria, a few years ago, that border road via Idlib to Aleppo had more than 40, whatever you want to say, checkpoints, control points, and so on. But they were not just sort of prefunctory control points. I mean, each of them, there was no central command telling all of them, you speak to one commander and then all 40 open up to you. You just have to show a permit. I mean, sometimes this means over days and weeks to make sure that one checkpoint is familiar with what you're trying to do, who you're doing, regardless of how many talks you've had with those people who oversee them. You have to take this down to the local level. Access negotiations very often is a local thing. So an OCHA office or a humanitarian coordinator very rarely carries out humanitarian frontline negotiations with those people themselves. But what OCHA does, and what the UN is trying to do, is to provide that framework, to keep communications lines open. So I remember, for example, in Afghanistan for many years, through Pakistan, we maintain sort of the main communications lines with the Taliban, and it doesn't mean that we passed judgment on whether good or bad, but it was just a very pragmatic relationship. So we spoke to someone, or someone spoke to someone in Pakistan. They then ensured, and this was tested by people on the ground, that aid convoys could progress. So you would come back sometimes and say, whatever conversation you've had with those guys in Pakistan didn't stand the ground when we actually tried to advance the convoy, because they stopped us and people had to return. So you have to remedy this. So what I'm trying to highlight, it's a very tedious exercise. And sometimes it's much better left to NGOs, to local partners who have the knowledge, who know how to open certain doors, than it is to international organizations to come in with big principles and fanfare. So it's a very pragmatic approach. But I think the central principle in all of this is we need to speak to those who have the power to change or make a difference. And that's not necessarily a beauty contest. If I may just abuse my right of speaking to make two more points. And I think all the speakers have sort of alluded to this, but to make this very clear, one of my pleas here is that we all have to contribute to not creating a permissive environment for such attacks and acts. And that is a much more subtle way sometimes than we may think. If you prioritize counterterrorism over humanitarian assistance, which is happening in some ways, people say, well, we're fighting the really bad boys, and just you have to come in when this area is cleaned or whatever it is. Then you're already creating sort of a doubt in people's minds whether these people really should be advancing or going or having access. You contribute to a non-permissive environment. If you question the need for humanitarian assistance in certain areas, if you question whether the tribes or the families under the control of a terrorist organization or an insurgent or just a party to the conflict should be receiving humanitarian aid, or that aid is going to be diverted and distorts the effort, you contribute to a non-permissive environment for these things. The criminalization of medical work, which is a serious problem and a growing problem at national levels, contributes to a non-permissive environment. And that's what we are trying to change today, accepting that these things are part of today's warfare landscape, creates permissive environment. So what all of this together, and probably a few other things, does to those people that we just referred to on the front lines who have to negotiate and say, what are you doing here? Go away. Or just like, you want to discuss, you want to reach out to those criminals, you're in bed with those terrorists or their families, and if you give it to the families, you give it practically to them. That talk or that line of thinking that I just outlined creates major impediments for people on the ground to actually advance their cause. The second point is on investigations. And I have to say, a point over the last 15 years or 20 years is that we have spoken a lot about investigations, but it's immediately also seen as criminal accountability and prosecution. While that is important, that's not all. And that's why I also would say, and it's a pity that our Security Council member states are no longer here. I would have said, do not wait for the Security Council to author, because that may not happen anytime soon. In very few cases, if ever. We're in a different environment, as I think the German ambassador highlighted very well. But we have experiences in Bosnia, in Kosovo, where commissions were created by those member states who believe that evidence needs to be secured. And so we need to look much more at what is possible below the level and outside the level of authorized formal Security Council authorized investigations. What's possible to secure the evidence, to get more information on what happened and why. And I feel like we almost need to go back to the future to learn from some of the lessons that we once knew better when we didn't have all those formal mechanisms, when we needed to help each other out through commissions, committees, and so on, that were financed by coalitions of the willing. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Hans-Jörg. A very strong finish to, I think, what's been a very valuable discussion, going back to Ambassador Heuschen's point that among all of the other recommendations, one thing that continues to be important is creating space for dialogue to highlight these issues, and I hope that we've done that today. So let me thank you for coming out this morning, and please join me in thanking all of our panelists.